Well, happy 4th of July, everyone. Glad you're here. I hope you get a little time off with your family, friends, and enjoy that. I want to say hi to a bunch of people. If you are in Missouri City at our Missouri City campus, I want to say hi to you guys down there. Chad Harold's down there, so he'd love to meet you, help you get connected there. If you're at the West End campus, down at Shepherd in Washington area, I want to say hi to all my friends there. I was there 2 weeks ago for Father's Day. We had these, I want to say old fashions, but they're not. They're cold fashions, which is a coffee drink that the coffee house created. So that was a lot of fun. I say hi to all the people at West End. If you're online with us, and we have lots of people online today, I've got a lot of family up in Washington State. I want to say hi to everyone online. We're glad you're here. And for those of us here at Richmond, hey, I want to tell you, if you're new with us today, if you're new, you should know this. I need you to know this, that I am not a normal speaker here. And in fact, it's with a lot of fear and trepidation that I'm here today. I'm scared to death, and I'm not joking. And some people say, well, you don't look nervous. You look fine up there. And I just want you to know that only God and whoever is doing my laundry knows what this is doing to me right now. And Patrick got me up here last year once or twice, and I made it through. And everyone was so encouraging and nice. And I asked you not to, but some of you went to Patrick and said I should be up here again. And I do not like you at all, I gotta tell you that. You are not my friends. But I'm here, we're gonna make it through this, hopefully, together. I appreciate you being here today. I've had an amazing summer. Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate that. I've had an amazing summer. In June 3rd, my middle daughter got married. Her name's Grace, and just amazing. She wanted to get married in my hometown, on my parents' place, a little piece of property. I'm from a little town called Linden, Washington, up in the Pacific Northwest, 2 hours north of Seattle. It's right on the Canadian border, about 30 minutes from snow-capped, glacier-covered mountains, the Cascade Range, and about 20 minutes or so from the Puget Sound, most beautiful ocean water you've ever seen. It's just absolutely gorgeous. It's a piece of heaven, quite frankly, if you go in the summer. There's about 3 months where you can go to Linden and actually enjoy yourself. And the rest of the time, it's amazing. It's a geographical oddity, quite frankly, because the high and the low is 38 degrees all winter long. And it's gloomy and drizzly and it's awful. So I don't live there. But the summer is magic, and the weather was magic, and just an incredible, incredible wedding event. And I found this out, because I'm not real bright when it comes to social norms, that the father of the bride is supposed to give a speech. And as you know, this is not my strong area. So I get full of anxiety, and I thought I'd just get out of it by saying, hey guys, thanks for coming, and let's give it up for him, and then out. But I Googled it, and you're supposed to do a little bit more than that. So I was trying to figure this out. Again, I'm a bit anxious about the whole thing. And as I was reflecting, I couldn't get over this idea of what God had done. What God had done in my life, in the events of my life, to bring us to this moment where my middle daughter would get married and all my friends and family, many come up from Houston to be there to celebrate with us. I just couldn't believe it. I just couldn't believe it. And I started thinking about that a little bit. And I think so often when we try to change our lives in all kinds of different areas, whether it's in your relationship with God or your relationship with others, your marriages or your finances, I think we get intentional and we work hard to make improvements. And I think that's really important and very helpful, and we should do that. But I think the bigger change in our life so often is God working in our lives, through events in our lives, to create a story to change our character. And so often it's events that we wouldn't choose necessarily. But God works to complete his perfect work and to change us. Philippians 1 verse 6 says this. It says, being confident of this very thing, he who has begun a good work in you will complete it until the day of Jesus Christ. I've also been reading a little bit about Moses again, his story this summer, and I couldn't help but see some parallels. And I love Moses because he's a leader's leader, and I'm kind of an organizational leader, kind of like that kind of thing. And Moses led 600,000 men, not counting women and children, but men, maybe 1 million people all told, out of Egypt, across the desert over a 40-year period into the land of Canaan. If you look at his life, you think, well, it makes some sense. He was a Hebrew, and he grew up in Pharaoh's court. So he had a tremendous amount of influence, and he had all the resources and all the advantages anyone could want if he was going to do something big with his life. His life started out amazing in that way. And yet, very quickly, it kind of takes a tragic turn. Pharaoh sees his Egyptians quarreling with his countrymen, Hebrew, and he goes and kills an Egyptian, takes matters in his own hand, kills an Egyptian. Then he tries to cover it up. And before long, he's exposed. People find out. And he's mocked by his own people. And he realizes that he's a murderer. He's going to get found out for this murder. And Pharaoh's going to have him executed. So he flees. He runs. And he runs the middle of the desert, and even the backside of the desert. And he's there for many years, in all likelihood, many years in the desert. And we find him, Exodus 3, verse 1, this is kind of the conclusion of that time. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law. He doesn't even have his own sheep. He's watching over his father-in-law's sheep. His father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west. My Bible actually says the backside of the wilderness. Have you ever found yourself in a wilderness? I know I have. I graduated with an MBA from grad school at the age of 24, top of my class. A small organization made me a CEO, and I had a lot of success growing that organization, accomplishing many things. We grew staff, we grew resources, fundraising, we did all kinds of projects, had a lot of success. Over the course of years, even though I was making a lot of money at the time, I found it ultimately, quite frankly, unfulfilling. I really wanted to be a family, and I really wanted a family, and I found myself alone. Unfulfilled. Is this what it's really all about? I had money, but I really didn't have, I couldn't figure out really what to do with it. And over the course of years, I became depressed, and I started making some poor decisions. I started making some poor decisions professionally, personally, some moral choices that I'm not proud of, and ultimately, I got very burned out on the whole thing. I started having some conflict with my board of directors, and I threw in the towel. After 10 years, in January of 2009, I resigned from that position, walked away, even though I had nothing to really go to. And that was the height of the 2008 recession, and times weren't great then. But I thought, well, I got a good resume. I should be able to find a job. How hard can it be? Well, I discovered it can be very difficult and very challenging. And I went month after month after month. I couldn't get an interview. And I moved to Washington, or I didn't move, but I went to Washington State. And I was looking for work up there, and I started to do a little bit of work for my dad at the time. I was living with my parents on this 20-acre piece of property, this little ranch that they had. My dad had this huge kind of low area that he wanted filled in. And there was a farm about 2 farms down, and they were building a big lake. So he had all kinds of fill dirt. My dad, he's a little bit crazy in this way, but he went and bought this junker old 5-yard dump truck. And I started moving dirt from this property to his property, load after load after load, day after day after day. And I thought, this is where my life has become. I'm moving dirt. And I knew God loved me, but I did not feel it. I just knew it mentally. I just tried to hold on, quite frankly, during that time, wondering, why am I here? And God had to teach me in that desert, in that wilderness. He had to humble me. He had to break me. Well, Moses finds himself in the backside of a desert. After many years, he's 80 years old at this time, 80 years old. And Moses sees a bush, and it's burning with fire, but the bush is not consumed. So he goes over and takes a look, and God speaks through him through the bush. It's Moses, Moses, I am the God of your fathers. And suddenly Moses realizes he's not forgotten. And the Lord says this, verse 7, I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. So I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up from the land to a good and large land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Just keep it here for a second. Go back one. So I have come down to deliver them, is what God is saying here. All right, next. Now therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppressed them. Moses was a Hebrew. He understands the Hebrews are in bondage in Egypt. And I'm sure this is a very welcome message, this idea that God is saying to Moses, I have come down to deliver them. But then it takes a turn for Moses. Come, I will send you. Well, what happened to I have come down? I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. And we see Moses immediately resist. He starts to resist this idea. Moses says to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? I think broken people find themselves on the run. And Moses was on the run. Broken people also struggle with this idea of their self-worth. And I think Moses is feeling that now. Who am I? I'm useless. I tried that once. It didn't work out. Pharaoh wants me dead. Next verse, I think. God says, I will be with you. Then Moses continues to resist. He says to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. Thus you shall say, I am has sent me to you. What does that mean? I was thinking about this. I heard a teacher once say that it was as if God was giving Moses a blank check. You need strength. I am your strength. You need courage. I am your courage. You need wisdom. I am your wisdom. I am with you. I will be with you. I was thinking about that, just even preparing this sermon, just those moments of panic that I had to fight through so often the last couple of weeks, and that just try to take this to heart. This idea that he is with me and that I can trust him and grow in my trust in him as I'm going through this process. But we see Moses resist further. He says, "But behold, they will not believe me. They'll not listen to my voice, for they will say, 'The Lord did not appear to you.'" Then the Lord said to him, "What is that in your hand?" And he said, "It's a staff." And God said, "Throw it on the ground." So he threw it on the ground, and it became a serpent. And Moses ran from it. Just love this little scene, the snake, and then Moses running in the other direction. And I thought, this actually just happened to me about a month ago. I was shutting down the house, and I went out my back porch to shut off the lights, and I take like 2 steps outside, and then there's this huge snake right there on my back porch. And I could not turn around fast enough. I made a sound I've never made before. I'm running back into the house, and my wife sees this whole thing. Of course, she can diagnose it. She's like, "You saw a snake, didn't you?" And I can hardly talk, It's like, And she's not having it. She's not having snakes at her house. So she's like, "You're going back out there." And after some arguing, I'm actually more afraid of her. So I go and get something. This literally happened, y'all. I'm so scared. I just can't even imagine this. And so I have a 10-year-old daughter named Lyndon. And I say, "Lyndon, you go first." Of course, by this time, it's like 30 minutes in, that snake is long gone. But what I should have done is called my, what would be my future son-in-law, Jerry. I met Jerry a year ago. Grace, my daughter, brought him to meet me, and so we're hanging out there. And during that time, I actually saw a snake in my garage, and of course, I'm so scared to death, I'm not going anywhere near there. Jerry goes into the garage, picks this thing up by his hands, puts it in a box, relocates the snake. I'm like, "Yes, you may marry my daughter." The answer is yes. Oh my gosh. Moses continues to resist. "Oh my Lord, I am not eloquent either in the past or since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and slow of tongue." This is me. This is my problem right here. Then the Lord said to him, "Who has made man's mouth? Now therefore go, I will be with your mouth. I will teach you what you shall speak." But he said, "Oh my Lord, please send someone else." After much resistance, Moses would go with his brother. They would talk to Pharaoh. And that's a very long story short. Pharaoh would let the people go. But we're so resistant to this idea of change or what God's doing. And we so resist change. I think so often we're just, quite frankly, we're scared. We're scared to leave the familiar for the unfamiliar. And sometimes we're scared to get some help. I talk to guys sometimes. I think it's more of a guy problem, this idea of going and getting help, whether it's, your marriage has got some issues to it, but you're just resistant to this idea of going and getting some counseling. Or going and get some financial counseling because your finances are a little bit upside down. Or your child's not doing great in school for whatever reason, so we're resistant to this idea of getting parenting help. And I can tell you, I've paid for so much help, and you have to fight through that whole thing because there's counselors that aren't great. But then if you put some work in, you'll find some help, and it'll unlock some things that'll make everything so much better and so much easier at times, if we can push through our resistance. But I'll tell you the thing that I can't do and I really struggle with. It's this idea of reaching out to my friends and to my colleagues and asking for help. I just cannot get myself over that hurdle. And I don't know what that resistance is. I can pay someone for help. I'll do all the counseling. I'll go to the doctors. I'll do all that. But the thought of reaching out to a group of friends and saying, I need some encouragement. The Bible says to encourage one another. And sometimes that's putting yourself in a position to receive encouragement and letting people know that you need it. And man, we resist this idea. Just putting this talk together. I've been in those areas where you're just like, oh my gosh, I got writer's block or something. I have no idea what to do. And I've tried to reach out through some text messages to some groups of people and to say, oh man, I'm struggling. I need you to pray for me. Push through that fear. One of those group threads happened to have, was my family, and so my wife is on it, and she's like, well, wow, this must really be bad if you're asking people to pray for you. I think leaders really struggle with this idea of letting people know what you need. Here's another thing I can't do, is I can't go get help from my neighbors in my neighborhood. I'll be working on a project or doing something around the house. This just happened. I can't remember the tool that I needed, but I found myself in need of something, and my wife comes in and she says, well, why don't you just go and borrow that from let's say it's a hammer, because that'll make the story work. Why don't you go borrow a hammer from the neighbors? And I think I'd rather give a sermon, as much as I hate this, than go and knock on my neighbor's door and ask for a hammer. Now, I don't know what, and she's looking at me like, what is wrong? You're such a wuss. What is wrong with you? I think it's, we get this twisted thinking, this faulty thinking as I've tried to figure this thing out, that somehow we believe in our minds that people don't want to help us. And that creates all kinds of barriers for us and hang-ups. And sometimes you have to unravel, what is my faulty thinking? Faulty thinking always manifests itself into behavior that's wonky. Sometimes I got to do some therapy on that. I want to do that right now. Let's do this. Let's say you have a hammer, everyone's got a hammer, and I come to you and ask you if I can borrow. Let's do this at Missouri City and West End. Let's assume that I can see you. Will you raise your hand if you'll lend me a hammer if I needed to borrow a hammer in the room? Keep your hands up. I got to see this. This is so helpful for me. Wow, we resist. We don't think people want to help us. We lack the courage sometimes to ask for help, to ask someone to encourage us. Sometimes we resist because our perspective is too limited. We don't understand the situation we're in. We don't understand how God could possibly use these circumstances or this moment to do something in us. And it doesn't make sense to us, or it doesn't reconcile with our idea of how our life should go, so we become very resistant to the whole idea. God's little exchange with Moses was the beginning. God had a much bigger plan in place to set free an entire nation. I think of Joseph. We looked at him earlier this year. Joseph spent years in prison in Egypt, falsely imprisoned in Egypt. And God would use that experience. Eventually, Joseph would become prime minister of Egypt. And eventually, he would save a nation, save his family. It all started from that experience. Falsely mistreated, falsely imprisoned. Even Paul, the Apostle Paul's life. Here's another murderer, by the way, murdering Christians in the name of God. Jesus would show up on the road and radically change his life. And Paul spent 3 years in Arabia before he would ever start his ministry and share the gospel, eventually writing most of the New Testament as we know it. But 3 years God worked on his character. Think of my daughter who wanted to, all her life she's wanted to be in med school or wanted to become a doctor. And So she applied to med school, took the MCAT, did all the work. It's not easy to do all that. And she didn't get in. And there's all the frustration and disappointment and the emotional impact that has, and wondering, what do you do? She didn't really have a backup plan. And I'm proud of her. She's retook the MCAT, going through the application process. In the meantime, a family reached out to her to ask her to help them take care of a 6-month baby boy. And this 6-month baby boy has cancer. And my daughter is going day after day to the hospital, the medical center, where he has to receive his chemotherapy treatments. I can't help but wonder, that setback with med school, and that potentially delay there, if God might use her in a powerful way to make a difference in this little child's life or in this family's life. Maybe God's doing something in her life through this whole thing. Well, we know the story of Moses, that this was really just the beginning. He would eventually lead the people across the desert over 40 years, many successes, many failures, quite an amazing journey across the desert. For me, my experience, when I was moving dirt, I eventually, I was about to take a job with a bookstore up in Washington State. And just as I was about to take that, Patrick calls me. He says, Dean, I want you to come down back to Richmond here, and I want you to have breakfast. So I came down, we had breakfast, and he said, I want you to think about overseeing the finances here at River Point Church. And he said, I really have no idea what I can pay you, but I know it won't be what you made before. And I go, well, it sounds like you need someone to understand the finances of River Point Church. Anyway, I knew for me, it wasn't about the money anymore. And I knew God was in this in some way. And it's a bit out of character for Patrick, but I'll tell you, I told him at the end of that, even though I really felt like God was opening this door and that this was the next step for me, I said, I'd really like to take the night to pray about it. And Patrick said, well, I don't have time for that. I need a yes or no. And so I said yes. And really that would be the beginning of a quite amazing journey, but an extraordinarily difficult journey. When I started here, I very quickly, I fell in love with Anne, who had 2 daughters. So we have a blended family. And I was 37 years old when I got married. And you know how they say that first year of marriage can be very difficult? Well, for us, it was more like 5 years of extraordinary, she's very extroverted, I'm very introverted. I had no idea the fights and the arguments and the struggle, and it was so moment by moment, are we going to make it? To make things worse, we had a middle schooler, and she immediately went into crisis, with all kinds of issues. And so we went program after program after program, spending a lot of money trying to figure out what kind of help and intervention we needed to do to keep my daughter moving forward. I'll tell you the end of that story very quickly so you know she doesn't get mad at me. She's actually thriving now, got a college degree and doing amazing work. She completely recovered from all that. Very grateful now today, but in that moment back then, in 2012, it was quite a conflict, to be sure. We just got married. Apparently, I didn't know how birth control worked, so she would get pregnant 1 week coming back from the honeymoon. We discovered she was pregnant. So I had a pregnant wife, a daughter in crisis, a blended marriage, and I was, talk about in over your head. It was crazy, and it was so impossibly difficult. But God used all of those events to change my character and to change me. And I had no idea it would be a blended family. I had no idea it would be 5 extremely difficult years. I had no idea the struggle that I would have in my marriage. But sometimes God will reveal to you what he was really after, and it's just really so amazing. For Moses, he was 120 years old, and God brought him to the top of the mountain, and God showed him the land that the people of Israel were about to inherit. And I can't help but think that Moses would have thought, oh my goodness, I had no idea what an amazing thing you would do in and through me. And for me, it was at my daughter's wedding on the very land that I had moved load after load after load of dirt. And I saw my daughter and her husband and all my friends and family coming from Houston and all my family up in Washington State together to celebrate this most amazing day. And I thought, wow. God will use the events of your life to change your life, to change you. We become very resistant because we have our own ideas of what that life should look like. And so often the events don't look like the ones that we think they should. But know this, God is faithful. God is faithful. You can trust him. He who started a good work in you will be faithful to complete it. Let us not resist. Get over that resistance and walk with him. Let me pray for us. Will you pray with me? God, thank you so much for your faithfulness. Thank you that you're good, even though the circumstances we find ourselves in, sometimes as a result of our poor choices, would suggest the future is bleak. God, I just pray that you would continue to do this amazing work you've promised to do, to complete that in us. And God, I pray that as we journey forward, many of us in the wilderness experience, even here today, that you would use us in a powerful way to encourage one another. That we would get over the resistance and the fears that we have, and that we would just take that next step to follow you, to trust in you. God, so often we're just so scared. We need courage today. We need wisdom today. We need strength today. So God, would you encourage the people in this room here today? Encourage us to be encouragers. Encourage us to reach out, let people know we need encouragement. I pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.